I had ironed her father's favorite shirt, baked her mother's lemon chiffon cake, and strung up lights since dawn, yet her name was not on the cruise ticket. The air still smelled like charcoal and barbecue sauce when I stepped back to check the buffet table one last time. Mom's potato salad sat in her floral bowl, just the way she liked it. The deviled eggs were chilled in the fridge, and the napkins were fanned in neat little triangles. Everything was in place. Everything had to be perfect for them. Out in the backyard, laughter rose in waves. Neighbors mingled beneath the string lights I'd spent hours hanging from the creaking patio beams. My younger sister, Carla, posed for selfies near the rose trellis, tilting her head just right. Dad stood with a beer in one hand, his other gesturing wide as he told a story I'd heard him repeat at every family gathering. I wasn't part of it, not really. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stepped out through the sliding doors, wearing the same summer dress I always wore to keep things low-key, as Mom called it. I smiled when I passed people, nodding when they said, "Smells great, Della," like I wasn't the one who'd been cooking all afternoon. The heat clung to the back of my neck and the humidity made the hair near my temples curl against my will. But I kept moving, refilling lemonade, collecting empty cups, checking that the music hadn't looped back to the same playlist. When I passed by the grill, I noticed Carla hadn't even touched the tongs I'd asked her to watch. Her husband was chatting with someone about cruise packages. Cruise packages. 2 weeks ago, I overheard Carla whispering to Mom in the hallway, "Don't tell her yet. Dad said it might upset things." I'd brushed it off. We were a big family. Not every trip could include everyone, but something about her voice, light, careless, had lingered with me like smoke on clean laundry. Dad tapped his fork against a wine glass. The crowd fell into a gentle hush. Mom stood beside him, her lipstick flawless as ever, her smile wide and fixed. "We've got some exciting news," Dad said, his voice booming with pride. "Next week, the Monroe family is sailing off to the Caribbean. 7 days on the open sea, every one of us together." Cheers erupted. Carla squealed, her arms wrapping around her husband. Someone popped open a fresh bottle of champagne. Maisie clapped beside me, hesitated, then gave me an uncertain glance. I stepped closer to the group. My heart thudded, not from excitement, but from that quiet, slow kind of dread that starts in your spine. "When are we leaving?" I asked, voice even. "I'll need to rearrange my schedule at work." For a second, everything froze. Not visibly, but I felt it. The weight in the air. The way Carla's eyes widened. The half-second pause in Dad's blinking. "You're not coming with us," he said, like it was obvious. His tone wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was casual. "This trip, it's for the rest of us. You just be stressed. You always worry too much." I waited for someone to laugh, to say it was a joke, but no one did. Mom sipped her wine. "You'd hate the crowds," she murmured without looking at me. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on the house." I opened my mouth to respond, then shut it again. I looked at Maisie. She looked away. Someone turned the music back on. A new song, something upbeat, flooded the awkward space like water rushing into a cracked hull. People began to chatter again, their eyes carefully avoiding mine. I walked back into the house. The sliding door closed with a click that felt more final than it should have. In the kitchen, the cake sat untouched. I sliced a small piece, placed it gently into a plastic container, and labeled it with today's date, for later, as if I still owed them leftovers. I opened the drawer beneath the phone, the one no one used anymore, and pulled out a manila envelope marked Naples, Florida, room deposit. I stared at the handwriting for a long while. It felt like looking at someone else's life plan, someone braver. I closed the drawer slowly, the edges of the envelope catching slightly before giving way. She unlocks the old desk drawer, pulls out a manila envelope marked Naples, Florida, room deposit, and closes it slowly. At dawn, I boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Naples with nothing but a week's rent, a beat-up camera case, and my quiet resolve. The terminal was mostly empty when I arrived, just a janitor humming near the vending machines and a man in overalls dozing beneath a blinking screen. I had 2 bags, one with clothes, the other with an old camera I hadn't touched in over a decade. I'd packed light, but my heart felt like I was hauling bricks. The bus arrived late, wheezing to a halt with the kind of reluctant sigh that only comes from something long used and barely loved. I chose a window seat near the middle, slipped my ticket into the plastic slot, and leaned my head against the cool glass. As the miles passed, I thought about that envelope. I'd put the deposit down 6 months ago, on a whim, after a sleepless night when I couldn't stand the way the hallway creaked outside my room like footsteps that always stopped short. Back then, Naples was just a name on a list, a maybe, a one day. But I remembered reading about it in a magazine once. The salt air, the quiet art fairs, the way the old couples walked hand in hand down the boardwalk like they still believed in each other. I had dreamed of going there for a honeymoon that never happened. Now it was an escape route. When the bus rolled into town, the sky was bright and hot, the kind of Florida heat that clung to your skin and whispered, "Slow down." The station was small, just an on-in, an old Coke machine, and a bulletin board covered in mismatched flyers. No one was waiting. No one knew me. That felt oddly comforting. I walked the 12 blocks to the address I'd scribbled on a napkin. Shorelight Brew, a small cafe with mint green trim, and a painted sign that leaned slightly to the left. It looked like it had been standing for years, stubborn and sure. Inside, the scent of coffee hit me first. Rich, bitter, alive. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter, polishing mugs with a cloth that looked older than me. Her hair was tucked under a paisley bandana, and her eyes were sharp like they'd seen everything and decided most of it wasn't worth flinching over. "You, Ruth?" I asked. "Depends who's asking," she said, still wiping. Then she looked up and saw the sweat on my forehead, the blisters on my fingers, the camera bag on my shoulder. "You the girl for the room?" I nodded. She didn't ask for ID, just handed me a worn key attached to a painted wooden fish and said, "Upstairs. Don't move furniture. Pay a week up front. No funny business." The attic room was just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a window that opened onto the cafe's parking lot. I dropped my bags, turned the fan on high, and sat on the edge of the bed. It creaked under me, familiar somehow. Everything did, like I was supposed to be here. Later that afternoon, I came back down and offered to help with dishes. Ruth snorted. "You know how to mop a floor?" "Yes, ma'am." She grunted, tossed me a rag, and said, "Let's see." That's how it started. I didn't apply. I didn't fill out forms. I just started cleaning tables, aligning menus, remembering faces. People called me Miss D by habit, the way Southerners do when they want to be respectful but not intimate. One morning after restocking creamers, I wandered into a secondhand store tucked between a laundromat and a bait shop. It smelled like old paperbacks and forgotten attics. In the far corner behind a rack of fishing vests, I saw it, a Canon AE1, same model I once owned in high school, back when I thought maybe I could study photography in Boston, before the stroke, before the debt, before the "we need you home." Its leather was peeling, and the strap was frayed, but it called to me like nothing had in years. "You want it?" the shopkeeper asked. He was hunched, voice raspy like gravel sliding down a pipe. "Still works, just need a film." I hesitated. It wasn't a wise buy, but I had cash tucked in the back of my journal, just enough. I handed it over. That evening, I sat on the back steps of Shorelight Brew, fingers curled around that old camera. The streetlights buzzed overhead. A couple walked past holding hands, their shadows long and quiet. I snapped a photo, no thought, just instinct. Then another. The pier, the sidewalk cracks, a forgotten tricycle by the curb. The shutter click stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I returned to the cafe early to sweep. Ruth was already there, rearranging muffins behind the glass. She eyed the camera dangling from my neck. "Didn't take you for a photographer," she said. "Used to be." "People don't stop being things," she muttered. "They just get quiet about it." That night, after close, I found a flyer pinned to the staff corkboard. Community Photo Club, Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Instructor, Hal Whitaker. In faded ink below, "Capture the world as you see it. No rules, just light." I stared at it for a long while. Hal sees me holding the camera and says, "You got a story in that hand. Come to class Tuesday night." While her family Instagrammed champagne on a cruise deck, I was hanging my third photo on a cafe wall next to the tip jar. The photo was a simple one, a bent wire chair left out in the rain, with morning light catching on its rust. Hal had said it told a quiet story, and that was all the encouragement I needed to frame it. Tuesday nights at the community center had become my favorite part of the week. The classroom smelled faintly of old wood and dark room chemicals. Hal didn't teach so much as guide. "We don't chase perfection," he'd say, pacing with his ink-stained hands folded behind him. "We chase truth. Sometimes that's a crooked line." There were only 5 of us in the class. Most were retired. Janice liked to photograph her cats in different costumes, and Mr. Ramirez brought in old snapshots from the 70s to compare angles. Me? I just watched light, how it slid through blinds, how it softened sharp things, how it clung to the edges of loneliness. After class, Hal handed me a folded paper. Local galleries putting together a summer show. Community work. Think about submitting. I nodded, unsure if I was ready. "You are," he said before I could answer. The next afternoon, Ruth asked me to run an errand, drop off a sack of old coffee cans to a photo lab across town. I tucked them into a cardboard box and walked the 12 blocks to a place called Everett Prints. The sign was barely legible, letters fading under sun-bleached awning. Inside, the air smelled like fixer and something older, dust, memory, maybe both. A bell chimed as I stepped in. "Hello?" I called. A man in his 70s emerged from behind a curtain. He wore suspenders and had a smudge of ink on his chin. "You must be Ruth's girl," he said, smiling. "I'm Tom. That's June in the back. Don't mind the radio. She's addicted to baseball this time of year." He took the box and waved me toward a stool near the front. Old photographs lined the walls, black and white wedding portraits, kids on tricycles, a dog leaping off a dock. "You shoot film?" he asked, nodding to the cannon around my neck. "Just picked it back up." "Good," he said. "Film's patient. Makes you see before you snap." As I was about to leave, he squinted at me. "You said your last name was Monroe?" I paused. "Yes, sir." His brow furrowed. "Hang on." He disappeared into the back. I waited, unsure what to expect. When he returned, he was carrying a manila folder, yellowed with time, bound by a rubber band. He set it on the counter gently. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said. "He had it stored with us years ago. Never picked it up." Inside were a few letters, some photo negatives, and a deed, official, notarized, bearing my name, dated 18 years ago. I stared at it, blinking, rereading each line. My name. The Monroe house. A line in neat ink. "This property is to belong solely to Della Monroe upon my passing." I felt my throat close. "They didn't tell you, did they?" June's voice came from behind me, soft and certain. "They probably didn't think you'd ask." I couldn't speak. My fingers tightened on the folder. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't a weapon. It was proof that I mattered, that someone saw me before I disappeared into their background. Tom gave me a small nod. "Do what feels right." That night, I walked home in silence, a folder clutched under my arm. Naples was quiet at dusk. A soft breeze stirred the Spanish moss. I could hear someone playing harmonica down by the pier. I sat at the cafe counter long after closing. The lights dimmed. Ruth didn't ask questions. She just poured me a fresh cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and slid a blueberry scone across the counter. She didn't ask what I'd found. She didn't need to. I read the document 3 times. Her hand trembles, not from rage, but from long-denied validation. I scanned the deed and began composing an email. To the Monroe family attorney. I pressed send, attaching the deed. While her family clinked champagne glasses beneath a tropical sunset they thought they had earned. I didn't expect anything to happen right away. I didn't want fireworks or confrontation, just acknowledgement, a ripple in the pond that proved I existed beyond my usefulness. The cafe opened early that day. The bell above the door jingled softly as the regulars came in. Mr. Hammond with his crossword puzzle, Miss Barrel asking for extra whipped cream on her mocha even though she always scraped it off. Ruth moved behind the counter with her usual focus, wearing a fresh apron and humming a Patsy Cline tune. I moved slower than usual, not tired, just elsewhere. As I wiped down the counter, I kept checking my phone, though I didn't know what I expected. A call, a legal notice, an apology. None came. Hal stopped by around noon. He ordered black coffee, glanced at the camera hanging around my neck, and asked, "You bringing something to the gallery preview?" I nodded. "Final set's done, just deciding which one leads." "What's the theme again?" "Roots and release." Hal gave a thoughtful smile. "Lead with the swing set photo. Empty seat, long shadows. It tells people what you carried, without saying it out loud." Back upstairs in my attic room, I laid out the 5 photos on the bed. They weren't flashy, they didn't scream for attention. They whispered, small scenes caught in natural light: the rusted bike, the porch rocker, the sandal by the dock, the mailbox leaning toward collapse, and that swing. Always that swing. I framed them, wrapped each carefully, and leaned them against the wall by the door. Still no messages. By late afternoon, my phone finally lit up. Voicemail from Mom. I played it twice, then once more, mostly for the tone. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the house. She just said, "This was cruel. You've embarrassed us. We didn't expect you to stoop to this." Then a long pause. Then the click of her hanging up. I sat still for a long while. The fan turned lazily overhead. Outside, kids laughed as they rode past on their bikes, red streamers fluttering behind them. The world kept moving, as if nothing had shifted at all. That night, Ruth stayed later than usual. We didn't speak much, just worked in quiet rhythm. When she saw me place my wrapped frames by the door, she nodded once. "You're going through with it?" "Yeah." She reached beneath the counter and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "Figured you might need this." Inside was a camera strap, handmade, leather with tiny red stitches running down both sides. "Made it from an old belt," she said. "Had it since I was 20. I ran my fingers along the worn edge. "Why give it to me?" "Because you didn't ask for it," she said simply. "You don't owe anyone the version of you they invented." I didn't cry, but something in my chest let go, like a knot finally loosened after being tight too long. Gallery day was tomorrow. Hal had emailed the schedule. My name was first on the program: Della Monroe, Roots and Release. I stood at the kitchen sink that night, staring out the tiny window into the dark. My reflection stared back, faint and tired, but steady. I thought of Dad, how he used to say, "Don't stir the pot unless you're ready to taste what comes out." I guess I was finally hungry for truth. I walked upstairs, laid the camera on my desk, and attached Ruth's strap with careful fingers. Then I reached for my laptop. "Gallery owner calls. Your work will open the event. Bring your best frame." Franklin walked into the gallery just before sundown, moving slowly, as if something heavy followed every step. I saw him the moment he entered. The old wooden doors creaked behind him, but he didn't flinch. He wore the same plaid shirt I'd ironed too many times to count, and his shoes were the kind you only pull out for funerals or fancy dinners. Probably both in his mind. He didn't look around, just stared ahead, toward the back where my photos hung beneath soft yellow lights. I stood near the refreshment table, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't sipped. My hands were cold, but my spine was steady. The gallery was buzzing, couples murmuring, older women leaning close to inspect brushstrokes, the faint rhythm of a jazz trio warming up outside. But for me, the room went quiet the moment he arrived. He paused in front of the first photo, the rusted bike chained to a sagging fence, then the second, the porch rocker, bathed in the soft blue of early morning. The third, fourth, his eyes stayed on the fifth one longer than the rest. It was the swing, an empty plastic swing hanging crooked from a steel frame, shadows stretching long behind it. The seat was cracked, the chains were rusted. It wasn't dramatic, but it said everything. I stepped outside. I needed air. There was a bench beneath the gallery's awning, just past a row of potted succulents. I sat there, letting the last light of the day wash over me, listening to the sound of laughter and camera shutters. Then footsteps, slow, familiar. He didn't sit immediately, just looked at me for a long time, the way you look at someone when you're not sure where the lines are anymore. "This wasn't how it was supposed to be," he said finally. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than I had ever heard from him. "No," I answered. "It wasn't, and I stopped waiting for someone to fix it." He nodded as if that was fair, as if he'd expected it. I looked at him then, not the man from my childhood, larger than life and always in control, but a man in his 70s, shoulders slumped, uncertain for once. "We thought you'd always be there," he said, quieter now. "You just handled things." "I didn't handle them because I wanted to," I replied. "I handled them because no one else did." He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. "You don't know how much you've sacrificed," he muttered. "You're right," I said. "You don't know because when I withdrew my college application to take care of Mom, you said it was the right thing to do. When I paid for Carla's wedding out of my savings, no one even said thank you." He didn't interrupt, just listened. "I didn't need credit," I added, "but I needed to matter. I needed to be seen as more than the girl who filled in the cracks." A breeze passed between us. The awning above fluttered. "I didn't know what I'd taken," he said softly. "I know," I replied. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him, and in that moment I realized I didn't need more. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really, I was just done. "I forgive what you didn't see, but I no longer carry it." He stayed quiet for a while longer, then stood. He didn't reach out, didn't say anything sentimental. He just gave a small nod and turned away. Franklin nods, quietly walks away, hands in pockets, never looking back. On the 4th of July, I poured coffee for a veteran named Hank, who saluted her photo on the cafe wall. He was a regular. Sat in the far corner near the window and always ordered the same thing. 1 black coffee, 1 cinnamon roll, no chit-chat. That morning, though, he stood quietly in front of the photo display near the register, right where I'd hung a small print of the pier at low tide. "That's yours?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded, eyes still fixed on the frame. "Reminds me of where I grew up. South Carolina coast. Lost my brother out there in '68. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence was more respectful than sympathy. Naples was bright that day. Flags flapped gently outside storefronts, and the smell of grilled hot dogs floated in from the marina. Ruth wore a red bandana and waved at every kid riding by on their bikes. Someone played ragtime on an out-of-tune piano near the pier. Inside Shorelight Brew, the air was calm, familiar. I'd heard through Maisie that my parents had moved out of the Monroe house a week after the email from the attorney landed. No fight, no dramatic exit, just boxes and silence. That was their way. The house was legally mine, but I didn't want it, not in the way they expected. I donated it to a women's recovery center based in Tallahassee. They turned it into transitional housing within weeks. I never told my parents. Carla called once. Her voice was clipped, formal. She said, "Mom's upset. Dad's pretending not to be. They don't understand why you did this." "I don't need them to," I replied. There was a long pause, then she said, "I'm still not sure if I do either." "That's okay." Maisie, though, she sent a text that morning, just a picture of sparklers and a caption. "You turned something broken into something beautiful." I saved it. Around lunchtime, I stepped out back to breathe and stretch. A soft wind swept through the alley, rustling the string lights Ruth had put up last Christmas and never taken down. A flyer from the Gulf Coast Photo Collective fluttered out of my mail cubby, reminding me that the traveling exhibit was real and I'd been invited to join. My work would go on the road, from here to Tallahassee, down through Sarasota, and then even into parts of Georgia. I didn't feel afraid, not this time. Before I left for the day, I took one last photo. Ruth standing behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, a faint grin on her face, as the sunlight caught her silver hair just right. She didn't notice the shutter click, but she smiled anyway. I printed that photo and pinned it beside my attic window the same night. Underneath it, I wrote, "This is what steady looks like." I opened my notebook, turned to a blank page, and let the pen settle in my hand. Some homes break you. Others rebuild you from what they never asked you to give up. Sometimes it isn't grand gestures that change a life, but the quiet decision to step away from what no longer sees you. Della didn't leave to prove a point. She left to remember who she was when no one was watching. Kindness doesn't always echo loudly, but it endures in the places we choose to build again, Like sunlight catching on a forgotten porch swing, dignity has a way of returning when we stop asking others to define it. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to notice the quiet strength sitting just beyond the spotlight.